Chapter 2 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 5. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 5 by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 2, The Trent Affair. The public mind would probably have dwelt with more impatience and dissatisfaction upon the inaction of the armies, but for an event which turned all thoughts with deep solicitude into an entirely different channel. This was what is known as the Trent Affair, which seriously threatened to embroil the nation in a war with Great Britain. The Confederate government had appointed 2 new envoys to proceed to Europe and renew its application for recognition, which former diplomatic agents had failed to obtain. For this duty, ex-Senator James M. Mason of Virginia and ex-Senator John Slidell of Louisiana were selected on account of their political prominence as well as their recognized ability. On the blockade runner Theodora, they, with their secretaries and families, succeeded in eluding the Union cruisers round Charleston and in reaching Havana, Cuba. Deeming themselves beyond danger of capture, they made no concealment of their presence or mission, but endeavored rather to magnify their office. The British consul showed them marked attention, and they sought to be presented officially to the Captain General of Cuba. But that wary functionary explained that he received them only as distinguished gentlemen. They took passage on board the British mail steamer Trent for St. Thomas, intending there to take the regular packet to England. Captain Charles Wilkes, commanding the United States war steamer San Jacinto, just returned from an African cruise, heard of the circumstance, and going to Havana, fully informed himself of the details of their intended route. The Trent, he learned, was to leave Havana on the 7th of November. That day found him stationed in the old Bahama Channel, near the northern coast of Cuba, where he had reason to believe she would pass. At about noon of the 8th, the lookout announced the approach of the Trent, and when she was sufficiently near, the San Jacinto fired a round shot across her course and displayed the American colors. The British steamer did not seem disposed to accept the warning and failed to slacken her speed, whereupon Captain Wilkes ordered a shell to be fired across her bows, which at once brought her to. Lieutenant D.M. Fairfax, with 2 officers and a guard of marines, left the San Jacinto and rowed to the mail steamer. The lieutenant mounted to the deck alone, leaving his officers and men in the boat. He was shown to the quarter-deck, where he met Captain Moir of the Trent, and informing him who he was, asked to see his passenger list. Captain Moir declined to show it. Lieutenant Fairfax then told him of his information that the rebel commissioners were on board, and that he must satisfy himself on that point before allowing the steamer to proceed. The envoys and their secretaries came up, and hearing their names mentioned, asked if they were wanted. Lieutenant Fairfax then made known in full the purport of his orders and the object of his visit, to seize the Confederate officials. The altercation called a considerable number of passengers around the group. All of them manifested open secession sympathy, and some indulged in abusive language so loud and demonstrative that the lieutenant's 2 officers and 6 or 8 armed men from the boat, without being called, mounted to the lieutenant's assistance. In these unfriendly demonstrations, the mail agent of the Trent, one Commander Williams, a retired British naval officer, made himself especially conspicuous with the declaration that he was the Queen's representative, and with various threats of the consequences of the affair. The captain of the Trent firmly but quietly refused all compliance or search, and the envoys and their secretaries protested against arrest, whereupon Lieutenant Fairfax sent one of his officers back to the San Jacinto for additional force. In perhaps half an hour, the second boat returned from the San Jacinto with some 24 additional men. Lieutenant Fairfax now proceeded to execute his orders without actual violence, and with all the politeness possible under the circumstances. Mason and Slidell and their secretaries, foreseeing the inevitable, had retired to their staterooms to pack their luggage. Thither it was necessary to follow them, and there the presence of the families of Slidell and Eustis created some slight confusion, and a few armed marines entered the cabin, but were sent back. The final act of capture and removal was then carried out with formal stage solemnity. Captain Wilkes's first instruction to Lieutenant Fairfax was to seize the Trent as a prize, but as he afterwards explained, I forbore to seize her, however, in consequence of my being so reduced in officers and crew, and the derangement it would cause innocent persons, there being a large number of passengers who would have been put to great loss and inconvenience, as well as disappointment, from the interruption it would have caused them in not being able to join the steamer from St. Thomas to Europe. The Trent was allowed to proceed on her voyage, while the San Jacinto steamed away for Boston, where she arrived on the 24th of November and transferred her prisoners to Fort Warren. The whole country rang with exultation over the exploit. The feeling was greatly heightened by the general public indignation at the unfriendliness England had so far manifested to the Union cause, but perhaps more especially because the two persons seized had been among the most bitter and active of the secession conspirators. The public press lauded Captain Wilkes. Boston gave him a banquet, and the Secretary of the Navy wrote him a letter of emphatic approval. He congratulated him on the great public service he had rendered in the capture, and expressed only the reservation that his conduct in omitting to capture the vessel must not be allowed to constitute a precedent. When Congress met on the 2nd of December following, the House of Representatives immediately passed a resolution without a dissenting voice, thanking Captain Wilkes for his brave, adroit, and patriotic conduct, while by other resolutions the President was requested to order the prisoners into close confinement in retaliation for similar treatment by the rebels of certain prisoners of war. The strong current of public feeling approved the act without qualification and manifested an instant and united readiness to defend it. President Lincoln's usual cool judgment at once recognized the dangers and complications that might grow out of the occurrence. A well-known writer has recorded what he said in a confidential interview on the day the news was received. I fear the traitors will prove to be white elephants. We must stick to American principles concerning the rights of neutrals. We fought Great Britain for insisting by theory and practice on the right to do precisely what Captain Wilkes has done. If Great Britain shall now protest against the act and demand their release, we must give them up, apologize for the act as a violation of our doctrines, and thus forever bind her over to keep the peace in relation to neutrals, and so acknowledge that she has been wrong for 60 years. The Cabinet generally coincided in expressing gratification and approval. The international questions involved came upon them so suddenly that they were not ready with decided opinions concerning the law and policy of the case. Besides, the true course obviously was to await the action of Great Britain. The passengers on board the Trent, as well as the reports of her officers, carried the news of the capture directly to England, where the incident raised a storm of public opinion even more violent than that in the United States, but very naturally on the opposite side. The government of England relied for its information mainly upon the official report of the mail agent, Commander Williams, who had made himself so officious as the Queen's representative, and who, true to the secession sympathies manifested by him on shipboard, gave his report a strong coloring of the same character. English public feeling, popular and official, smarted under the idea that the United States had perpetrated a gross outrage, and the clamor for instant redress left no room for any calm consideration of the far-reaching questions of international law involved. There seemed little possibility that a war could be avoided, and England began immediate preparations for such an emergency. Some 8,000 troops were dispatched to Canada, ships were ordered to join the English squadrons in American waters, and the usual proclamation issued prohibiting the export of arms and certain war supplies. 2 days after the receipt of the news, Lord Palmerston, in a note to the Queen, formulated the substance of a demand to be sent to the United States. He wrote, November 29, 1861, "The general outline and tenor which appeared to meet the opinions of the Cabinet would be that the Washington Government should be told that what has been done is a violation of international law and of the rights of Great Britain, and that your Majesty's Government trusts that the act will be disavowed, and the prisoners set free and restored to British protection, and that Lord Lyons should be instructed that if this demand is refused, he should retire from the United States. On the following day the formal draft of the proposed dispatch to Lord Lyons was laid before the Queen, who, together with Prince Albert, examined it with unusual care. The critical character of the communication and the imminent danger, the almost certainty, of a rupture and war with America which it revealed made a profound impression upon both. Prince Albert was already suffering from the illness which terminated his life 2 weeks afterwards. This new and grave political question gave him a sleepless night. He could eat no breakfast, is the entry in Her Majesty's diary, and looked very wretched. But still he was well enough on getting up to make a draft for me to write to Lord Russell in correction of his draft to Lord Lyons, sent me yesterday, which Albert did not approve. The Queen returns these important drafts, which upon the whole she approves, but she cannot help feeling that the main draft, that for communication to the American Government, is somewhat meagre. She should have liked to have seen the expression of a hope that the American captain did not act under instructions, or if he did, that he misapprehended them, that the United States Government must be fully aware that the British Government could not allow its flag to be insulted, and the security of her mail communications to be placed in jeopardy, and Her Majesty's Government are unwilling to believe that the United States Government intended wantonly to put an insult upon this country, and to add to their many distressing complications by forcing a question of dispute upon us, and that we are therefore glad to believe that upon a full consideration of the circumstances of the undoubted breach of international law committed, they would spontaneously offer such redress as alone could satisfy this country, viz., the restoration of the unfortunate passengers and a suitable apology. It proved to be the last political memorandum he ever wrote. The exact language of his correction, had it been sent, would not have been well calculated to soothe the irritated susceptibilities of Americans. To the charge of violating international law, to which Palmerston's cold note confined itself, he added the accusation of wanton insult, though disclaiming a belief that it was intended. But a kind and pacific spirit shines through his memorandum as a whole, and it is evident that both the Queen and himself, gratefully remembering the welcome America had lately accorded the Prince of Wales, shrank from the prospect of an angry war. In this the Queen unconsciously responded to the impulse of amity and goodwill which had induced the President to modify so materially his Foreign Secretary's dispatch of the 21st of May, the unpremeditated thought of the ruler in each case being at once wiser and more humane than the first intention of the diplomatists. It was from the intention rather than the words of the Prince that the Queen's ministers took their cue and modified the phraseology into more temperate shape. Earl Russell wrote, Her Majesty's Government, bearing in mind the friendly relations which have long subsisted between Great Britain and the United States, are willing to believe that the United States naval officer who committed this aggression was not acting in compliance with any authority from his Government, or that if he conceived himself to be so authorized, he greatly misunderstood the instructions he had received. For the Government of the United States must be fully aware that the British Government could not allow such an affront to the national honor to pass without full reparation, and Her Majesty's Government are unwilling to believe that it could be the deliberate intention of the Government of the United States unnecessarily to force into discussion between the two governments a question of so grave a character, and with regard to which the whole British nation would be sure to entertain such unanimity of feeling. Her Majesty's Government, therefore, trusts that when this matter shall have been brought under the consideration of the Government of the United States, that Government will of its own accord offer to the British Government such redress as alone would satisfy the British nation, namely, the liberation of the 4 gentlemen, and their delivery to your lordship, in order that they may again be placed under British protection, and a suitable apology for the aggression which has been committed. Should these terms not be offered by Mr. Seward, you will propose them to him. In the private note accompanying this formal dispatch, further instruction was given that if the demand were not substantially complied with in 7 days, Lord Lyons should break off diplomatic relations and return with his whole legation to London. Yet at the last moment Lord Russell himself seems to have become impressed with the brow-beating precipitancy of the whole proceeding, for he added another private note better calculated than even the Queen's modification to soften the disagreeable announcement to the American Government. He wrote to Lord Lyons: "My wish would be that at your first interview with Mr. Seward you should not take my dispatch with you, but should prepare him for it, and ask him to settle it with the President and the Cabinet what course they will propose. The next time you should bring my dispatch and read it to him fully. If he asks what will be the consequence of his refusing compliance, I think you should say that you wish to leave him and the President quite free to take their own course, and that you desire to abstain from anything like menace." This last diplomatic touch reveals that the Ministry, like the Queen, shrank from war, but that it desired to reap all the advantages of a public menace, even while privately disclaiming one. The British demand reached Washington on the 19th of December. It happened, fortunately, that Lord Lyons and Mr. Seward were on excellent terms of personal friendship, and the British envoy was therefore able to present the affair with all the delicacy which had been suggested by Lord Russell. The Government at Washington had carefully abstained from any action other than that already mentioned. Lord Lyons wrote: "Mr. Seward received my communication seriously and with dignity, but without any manifestation of dissatisfaction. Some further conversation ensued in consequence of questions put by him with a view to ascertain the exact character of the dispatch. At the conclusion he asked me to give him tomorrow to consider the question and to communicate with the President." Another dispatch from Lord Lyons shows that Mr. Seward asked a further delay, and that Lord Russell's communication was not formally read to him till Monday, the 23rd of December. If we may credit the statement of Secretary Welles, Mr. Seward had not expected so serious a view of the affair by the British Government, and his own language implies as much when, in a private letter some months afterward, he mentions Lord Lyons's communication as our first knowledge that the British Government proposed to make it a question of offense or insult, and so of war, adding: "If I had been as tame as you think would have been wise in my treatment of affairs with that country, I should have no standing in my own." But while Mr. Seward, like most other Americans, was doubtless elated by the first news that the rebel envoys were captured, he readily discerned that the incident was one of great diplomatic gravity and likely to be fruitful of prolonged diplomatic contention. Evidently in this spirit, and for the purpose of reserving to the United States every advantage in the serious discussion which was unavoidable, he prudently wrote in a confidential dispatch to Mr. Adams on November 27: "I forbear from speaking of the capture of Messrs. Mason and Slidell. The act was done by Commodore Wilkes, without instructions, and even without the knowledge of the Government. Lord Lyons has judiciously refrained from all communication with me on the subject, and I thought it equally wise to reserve ourselves until we hear what the British Government may have to say on the subject." Of the confidential first interviews between the Secretary of State and the President on this important topic there is no record. From what remains we may easily infer that the President clearly saw the inevitable necessities surrounding the question, and was anxiously searching some method of securing for the United States whatever of indirect advantage might accrue from compliance with the British demand, and of making that compliance as palatable as might be to American public opinion. In this spirit we may presume he wrote the following experimental draft of a dispatch preserved in his autograph manuscript. Its chief proposal is to arbitrate the difficulty, or in the alternative, seriously to examine the question in all its aspects, and out of them to formulate a binding rule for both nations to govern similar cases. It was an honest and practical suggestion to turn an accidental quarrel into a great and durable transaction for the betterment of international law. The dispatch of Her Majesty's Secretary for Foreign Affairs, dated the 30th of November, 1861, and of which Your Lordship kindly furnished me a copy, has been carefully considered by the President, and he directs me to say that if there existed no fact or facts pertinent to the case beyond those stated in said dispatch, the reparation sought by Great Britain from the United States would be justly due and should be promptly made. The President is unwilling to believe that Her Majesty's Government will press for a categorical answer upon what appears to him to be only a partial record, in the making up of which he has been allowed no part. He is reluctant to volunteer his view of the case with no assurance that Her Majesty's Government will consent to hear him, yet this much he directs me to say, that this Government has intended no affront to the British flag or to the British nation, nor has it intended to force into discussion an embarrassing question, all which is evident by the fact hereby asserted, that the act complained of was done by the officer without orders from or expectation of the Government. But being done, it was no longer left to us to consider whether we might not, to avoid a controversy, waive an unimportant though a strict right, because we too, as well as Great Britain, have a people justly jealous of their rights, and in whose presence our Government could undo the act complained of only upon a fair showing that it was wrong, or at least very questionable. The United States Government and people are still willing to make reparation upon such showing. Accordingly, I am instructed by the President to inquire whether Her Majesty's Government will hear the United States upon the matter in question. The President desires, among other things, to bring into view and have considered the existing rebellion in the United States, the position Great Britain has assumed, including Her Majesty's proclamation in relation thereto, the relation the persons whose seizure is the subject of complaint bore to the United States, and the object of their voyage at the time they were seized, the knowledge which the master of the Trent had of their relation to the United States, and of the object of their voyage at the time he received them on board for the voyage, the place of the seizure, and the precedents and respective positions assumed in analogous cases between Great Britain and the United States. Upon a submission containing the foregoing facts, with those set forth in the before-mentioned dispatch to your Lordship, together with all other facts which either party may deem material, I am instructed to say, the Government of the United States will, if agreed to by Her Majesty's Government, go to such friendly arbitration as is usual among nations, and will abide the award. Or, in the alternative, Her Majesty's Government may, upon the same record, determine whether any, and if any, what reparation is due from the United States, provided no such reparation shall be different in character from, nor transcend that proposed by your Lordship, as instructed in and by the dispatch aforesaid, and provided further that the determination thus made shall be the law for all future analogous cases between Great Britain and the United States. We may suppose that upon consultation with Mr. Seward, Mr. Lincoln decided that, desirable as this proceeding might be, it was precluded by the impatient, inflexible terms of the British demand. Only 3 days of the 7 days' grace remained. If they should not, by the coming Thursday, agree to deliver Mason and Slidell, the British legation would close its doors, and the consternation of a double war would fill the air. It is probable, therefore, that even while writing this draft, Lincoln had intimated to his Secretary of State the need of finding good diplomatic reasons for surrendering the prisoners. A note of Mr. Seward shows us that the Cabinet meeting to consider finally the Trent question was appointed for Tuesday morning, December 24, but the Secretary says that, availing himself of the President's permission, he had postponed it to Wednesday morning at 10 a.m., adding, "I shall then be ready." It is probably true, as he afterwards wrote, that the whole framing of his dispatch was left to his own ingenuity and judgment, and that neither the President nor any member of the Cabinet had arrived at any final determination. The private diary of Attorney General Bates supplies us some additional details. Cabinet council at 10 a.m., December 25, to consider the relations with England on Lord Lyons's demand of the surrender of Mason and Slidell. A long and interesting session lasting till 2 p.m. The instructions of the British Minister to Lord Lyons were read. There was read a draft of answer by the Secretary of State. The President's experimental draft, quoted above, was not read. There is no mention of either the reading or the points it raised. The whole discussion appears to have been confined to Seward's paper. There was some desultory talk, a general comparing of rumors and outside information, a reading of the few letters which had been received from Europe. Mr. Sumner, chairman of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, was invited in and read letters he had received from John Bright and Richard Cobden, Liberal members of the British Parliament and devoted friends of the Union. During the session, also, there was handed in and read the dispatch just received from his government by Monsieur Mercier, the French minister, and which in substance took the English view of the matter. The diary continues. Mr. Seward's draft of letter to Lord Lyons was submitted by him and examined and criticized by us with apparently perfect candor and frankness. All of us were impressed with the magnitude of the subject, and believed that upon our decision depended the dearest interest, probably the existence of the nation. I, waiving the question of legal right, upon which all Europe is against us, and also many of our own best jurists, urged the necessity of the case, that to go to war with England now is to abandon all hope of suppressing the rebellion, as we have not the possession of the land nor any support of the people of the South. The maritime superiority of Britain would sweep us from all the southern waters. Our trade would be utterly ruined, and our treasury bankrupt. In short, that we must not have war with England. There was great reluctance on the part of some of the members of the Cabinet, and even the President himself, to acknowledge these obvious truths, but all yielded to and unanimously concurred in Mr. Seward's letter to Lord Lyons, after some verbal and formal amendments. The main fear, I believe, was the displeasure of our own people, lest they should accuse us of timidly truckling to the power of England. The published extracts from the diary of Secretary Chase give somewhat fully his opinion on the occasion. Mr. Chase thought it certainly was not too much to expect of a friendly nation, and especially of a nation of the same blood, religion, and characteristic civilization as our own, that in consideration of the great rights she would overlook the little wrong, nor could he then persuade himself that, were all the circumstances known to the English government as to ours, the surrender of the rebel commissioners would be insisted upon. The Secretary asserted that the technical right was undoubtedly with England. Were the circumstances reversed, our government would, Mr. Chase thought, accept the explanation and let England keep her rebels, and he could not divest himself of the belief that, were the case fairly understood, the British government would do likewise. But, continued Secretary Chase, we cannot afford delays. While the matter hangs in uncertainty, the public mind will remain disquieted. Our commerce will suffer serious harm. Our action against the rebels must be greatly hindered, and the restoration of our prosperity, largely identified with that of all nations, must be delayed. Better, then, to make now the sacrifice of feeling involved in the surrender of these rebels, than even avoid it by the delays which explanations must occasion. I give my adhesion, therefore, to the conclusion at which the Secretary of State has arrived. It is gall and wormwood to me. Rather than consent to the liberation of these men, I would sacrifice everything I possess. But I am consoled by the reflection that while nothing but severest retribution is due to them, the surrender under existing circumstances is but simply doing right, simply proving faithful to our own ideas and traditions under strong temptations to violate them, simply giving to England and the world the most signal proof that the American nation will not, under any circumstances, for the sake of inflicting just punishment on rebels, commit even a technical wrong against neutrals. In these two recorded opinions are reflected the substantial tone and temper of the Cabinet discussion, which ended, as both Mr. Bates and Mr. Seward have stated, in a unanimous concurrence in the letter of reply as drawn up by the Secretary of State. That long and remarkably able document must be read in full, both to understand the wide range of the subject which he treated and the clearness and force of his language and argument. It constitutes one of his chief literary triumphs. There is room here only to indicate the conclusions arrived at in his examination. First, he held that the 4 persons seized and their dispatches were contraband of war. Second, that Captain Wilkes had a right by the law of nations to detain and search the Trent. Third, that he exercised the right in a lawful and proper manner. Fourth, that he had a right to capture the contraband found. The real issue of the case centered in the 5th question. Did Captain Wilkes exercise the right of capturing the contraband in conformity with the law of nations? Reciting the deficiency of recognized rules on this point, Mr. Seward held that only by taking the vessel before a prize court could the existence of contraband be lawfully established, and that Captain Wilkes, having released the vessel from capture, the necessary judicial examination was prevented and the capture left unfinished or abandoned. Mr. Seward's dispatch continued: I trust that I have shown to the satisfaction of the British Government, by a very simple and natural statement of the facts and analysis of the law applicable to them, that this Government has neither meditated nor practiced nor approved any deliberate wrong in the transaction to which they have called its attention, and on the contrary, that what has happened has been simply an inadvertency, consisting in a departure by the naval officer, free from any wrongful motive, from a rule uncertainly established, and probably by the several parties concerned either imperfectly understood or entirely unknown. For this error the British Government has a right to expect the same reparation that we, as an independent state, should expect from Great Britain or from any other friendly nation in a similar case. If I decide this case in favor of my own government, I must disavow its most cherished principles, and reverse and forever abandon its essential policy. The country cannot afford the sacrifice. If I maintain those principles and adhere to that policy, I must surrender the case itself. The 4 persons in question are now held in military custody at Fort Warren, in the State of Massachusetts. They will be cheerfully liberated. With the formal delivery of Mason and Slidell and their secretaries to the custody of the British minister, the diplomatic incident was completed on the part of the United States. Lord Russell, on his part, while announcing that Her Majesty's Government differed from Mr. Seward in some of the conclusions at which he had arrived, nevertheless acknowledged that the action of the American Government constituted the reparation which Her Majesty and the British nation had a right to expect. It is not too much to say that not merely the rulers and cabinets of both nations, but also those of all the great European powers, were relieved from an oppressive apprehension by this termination of the affair. If from one point of view the United States suffered a certain diplomatic defeat and humiliation, it became in another light a real international victory. The turn of affairs placed not only England, but France and other nations distinctly on their good behavior. In the face of this American example of moderation, they could no longer so openly brave the liberal sentiment of their own people by the countenance they had hitherto given the rebellion. So far from improving or enhancing the hostile mission of Mason and Slidell, the adventure they had undergone served to diminish their importance and circumscribe their influence. The very act of their liberation compelled the British authorities sharply to define the hollow pretense under which they were sent. In his instructions to the British Government vessel which received them at Provincetown and conveyed them to England, Lord Lyons wrote, "It is hardly necessary that I should remind you that these gentlemen have no official character. It will be right for you to receive them with all courtesy and respect as private gentlemen of distinction, but it would be very improper to pay to them any of those honors which are paid to official persons." The same result in a larger degree awaited their advent in Europe. Under the intense publicity of which they had been the subject, officials of all degrees were in a measure compelled to avoid them as political suspects. Mason was received in England with cold and studied neglect, while Slidell in France, though privately encouraged by the Emperor Napoleon III., finally found himself a victim instead of a beneficiary of his selfish schemes. CHAPTER III.